I'm very happy to welcome you to this special installment of the Warburg Institute's Director Seminar. Now, I usually say at the beginning of these meetings, welcome to the Warburg Institute's virtual lecture room, but this time it would be more appropriate to say welcome to the virtual exhibition hall, and indeed, welcome to all of the Warburg Institutes, past, present, and future. Tonight, we are launching an exhibition in Norway devoted to models of the various buildings occupied by the Warburg Institute since its beginning, so over the last century. These models were researched and produced by students in the PhD program in architecture and design in Oslo, working under the supervision of Tim Anstey and Mari Lending. Now, I've been lucky to be involved in this project alongside Uwe Fleckner from the Warburg House in Hamburg and Dag Erik Elgin from Oslo at pretty much every stage of its development. And I have to say, it's felt like an absolute gift to me, not just because as director of the Warburg Institute, as you can imagine, I have a natural interest in our history, but also because, as many of you know, it came just as we were preparing for major changes to the building we occupy in Bloomsbury, and indeed that we have occupied since 1958. The next few years will see the complete renovation and extension of the Warburg Institute's current home in Woburn Square, one of Charles Holden's final projects and the last piece of his master plan for the University of London's central estate. Our architects for this project are Haworth Tompkins, and we've been very happy that their master model maker, Ellie Sampson, was able to work closely with Tim and Mari's team on their models, just as she was developing her own model of our new structure in the Warburg Institute's empty courtyard. So tonight's session, in fact, gives two sneak previews. First, of the brilliant exhibition that opens tomorrow in Oslo, and second, of Haworth Tompkins' beautiful extension that's due to open in the end of 2023. Now, we're mostly going to hear from the model makers themselves and what they have learned in the course of their work about the connections between architectural space, intellectual order, and cultural survival. But Tim Anstey has already taught us much about these topics through his deep research on the history of the Warburg Institute's buildings. And indeed, some of you may remember his own director's seminar on the subject a couple of years ago. So it's a special pleasure to have Tim back with us in London, or in virtual London, and to have this opportunity to thank him for all he has helped us to see and think, and to remember and to imagine, as well as to congratulate him and the whole team for the exhibition that we will now be hearing about. So without further ado, Tim, I hand over to you, and you should take it from here.
Thank you so much. I will just share screen and pitch right in.
Good.
Does that look all right?
It does.
Does that
Perfect.
look good? Yeah, well, we'd like to say an incredible thank you for this opportunity to visit you over there from over here. What we're going to do tonight is, as Bill said, we'll talk about two projects, but we'll talk about it in three sections. I'm going to make a kind of short introduction, well, I call it short, which talks a little bit about the background of why we think it's interesting to discuss models and architecture in relationship to Aby Warburg. Then we're going to talk a lot about making models. That's because all of us in this group, and this is us and Haworth Tompkins and Ellie, think this is really an understudied and very interesting subject in relationship to architecture and art history, I suppose you could say. So I just want to come in to tell you the background to an exhibition that's opening tomorrow in a little hamlet outside Oslo called Blokke, which is called Warburg Models på Blokke, or Warburg Models at Blokke. And I'm going to come into this elliptically, and this is of course very Warburgian, an elliptical route in, and this I think is necessary to talk about why think about architecture in relationship to Aby Warburg as a kind of subject, and why think about the model. We'll look at this. a water tower in Hamburg, commissioned in 1915, redundant by 1923, and the building in which Aby Warburg is instrumental in having a planetarium installed within. And as you will know, as part of that project, Aby Warburg and Fritz Saxel create an exhibition. And that exhibition is an exhibition about the history of astrology and astronomy. And lots of people here know this subject inside out and better than I do. But what I think I can show you, which is fun and maybe opens up a space, is this is a drawing by Hans Loop, the architect that they employed, which shows the space in which the Ausstellung Professor Warburg should happen. And what I've done is I've noted in that space the way in which Saxel and Warburg organized this exhibition. And this for me is really interesting, because what they do is they create in this space a series of 18 stations which explain the history of man's modeling of the cosmos through from ancient Egypt all the way to Kepler. And it's bound into the structure of the architecture. So you have the structure of the architecture that makes these places, and in these places, Warburg and Saxel establish themes, which they then explore through images. Now, this wasn't the first time, of course, that Warburg had understood a cosmological scheme via an architectural interior. His seminal lecture around this Schifferneuer, as you will all very well know, read the frescoes in an architectural space. And of course, what Warburg did and the way he was unable to unfold what was going on in that space, no one had understood what these frescoes stood for, is central to Warburg studies. But what I think we want to point to here is the reason, or part of the reason, that that analysis could be made was the way in which these things were presented to Warburg in an architectural space. And I think his sensitivity to the wholeness of that space in understanding this system. So in the space, in the Schifferneuer, you enter a room, you rotate anti-clockwise around the room, and by doing so, you become aware of a cosmological scheme, an overlapping cosmological scheme, which involves astrology from ancient Egypt, Greco-Roman, and European medieval. And it seems to us that there is a resonance between this and this. And this is really, I think, the kind of the beginning point of what we're interested in, that somehow both of these things are models, they're cosmological models. At the Schifferneuer, it's a model about three systems that order how the world works. In Hamburg, it's a model of how man has thought about the cosmos. So it seems that in that, the architectural is incredibly important. And I think perhaps there's a space to discuss. And that space gets more exciting when you see the details of what was in this exhibition, the planetarium. In the middle of the space, there are these mysterious black boxes. And as you find and research and look at Uwe Fleckner's work, amongst others, you realize that these black boxes were actually dioramas. They were specifically architectural models that Saxel and Warburg discussed intensively in creating the exhibition. And these models model spaces that also convey a cosmological schema. So there's a kind of nesting in this project. Inside this model of a cosmology in an architectural space are models, architectural models that also model the cosmology. It's a fantastically rich project. And so this awakened our interest in Warburg's relationship to architecture, actually Warburg's relationship to the model, and the Warburg Institute's kind of investment in these things. And as I said in my lecture previously, you know, this investment was a long term and I think very committed. 5 projects to create spaces for the Institute itself over 30 years, and 2 related projects. So what we're going to talk to you tonight about is an exhibition which models 7, we could say, architectural objects. The 5 that are to do with the Institute itself are listed here. So we start off in 1926 with the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg in Hamburg. As you all know, we have the Hamburg Planetarium that I've talked about. We have Thames House, which is the building in which the Warburg Library arrived in London in 1934. We have the Imperial Institute buildings, which it transferred to in the 1930s, stayed in until the 1950s, but had a particular point of interest in 1952. And then we have the building which, let's say, we are all sitting in today, the Warburg Institute at Woburn Square. And in relationship to do that, there are two outlying projects which are kind of very dear to us. And they wrap the kind of traumatic moment of moving the library from Hamburg to London, from the from the KBW to Thames House. One of those objects is a ship, the Hermia, that took the library from Hamburg to London. The other of those is a projected building that was never built, which we discovered documentary evidence about in the RIBA archive, which I talked about in my last lecture, which was a house commissioned by Fritz Saxel and Gertrude Bing. So these are the 7 objects. And really what this exhibition does is it makes a model of each of these objects and presents these models in a space in the Norwegian countryside. Now, just to give you the background and to open the exhibition, I have to give you a kind of a sort of series of other frames to understand it. And the first of those is about the container, right? The place where the exhibition is. It's at a place called Guttormgards Archiv, and Guttormgard is a very intriguing Norwegian graphic artist and collector who bought as his studio, home, and storage for this extraordinary collection an old dairy outside Oslo. And so the frame for this project is both the physical building and a kind of another, we cannot equate it with Warburg, but another very powerful world that's been created by someone who collects things from the past. You can Google and look at Guttormgards Arkiv's archive online, and there is something Warburgian about Guttorm. He is a collector who collects with no regard to existing hierarchies of importance, collections in which the priceless, fragile, and valuable is valued equally to what people would think of the ephemeral and worthless. And these are put into a kind of fantastic system. He was also a collector of interiors, of views, of spaces in which these objects were articulated. And so this is the frame in which the exhibition happens. And because of her fantastic collaboration with the archive through LF Presssetter, who I hope is here tonight, we've been able to occupy the domestic spaces that this artist had for himself and think through how these can become spaces for display, which is part of the project of this evolving institution, foundation. And we were allowed to use this extraordinary and very, very nice, very beautiful series of enfilade spaces that were his home. I have to say something about color. We became fascinated by the Warburg Library's use of color as an abstract way of creating categories and juxtapositions. And this is a big story. This is a piece of archive evidence from the archive where you are at the WIA. And fascinatingly, the kind of esoteric numbering system that gave K to be the letter for archaeology or A to be the letter for philosophy was reflected in a color scheme already created in the 1920s by the Warburg and in use right the way through to the 1950s, in part when the new building was created. And so we've adopted those colors into our models. And we think that this does something interesting. It creates a kind of space of abstraction to create comparisons. And we think this color or absence of color to do this is an interesting subject. I need to say a little bit about display and support. This is the planetarium stand for the models. In our exhibition, the models and their stands are really the work. So the creation of the stands became absolutely vital. This is Max Svensson, who's going to talk in a minute, welding up display stands for these beautiful architectural models, and their nesting and their own character and the way they could move became essential. And the last thing I want to talk about is the way these was about architectural models, because of course, like many forms of mediation, architectural models are both objects and representations of other objects. But it seems to us there's a kind of particular frissons or indexicality in that relationship for an architectural model that we enjoy. And so in terms of labeling this work, all the labelings become doubled. We have one label which takes the color from the Warburg Library, which talks about the model, its maker, its materials, its relationship to the Warburg system, its ownership, and another model that talks about the building or the object, its commissioning and its history. And these histories are kind of poetic, and often the Warburg Institute is one among other things in this history. So this is something that has been important to us, but particularly the mixture of the materiality and the question of moving. And I'm going to finish just with a slide of the model that's not there yet, which Mara Trubenbach in our project is making, which is of the Hermia. And this ship, there is something very powerful about this, and none of us have really looked at it yet. We're still arguing about what it is about the ship that's so powerful, but certainly in terms of one of our realizations, which is you can think of these buildings kind of as Bilderfahrzeuge. You can think of them as image vehicles, even if they stay still. The object that transfers all those fabulous images and texts from Hamburg to London and is kind of a building that moves. It's particularly fascinating. And as you know, Warburg was very interested in buildings that moved. And in relationship to that also, we're very interested in how this exhibition moves. These objects that we have made, the intention is that they will move, they will circulate through the world. And in moving them, we have to pack them and we have to case them. And that whole operation is the thing we're thinking about now. So that's really the end of my short introduction. The ship gets its own plinth at Blaker, looking over the Glomma River. The ship hasn't arrived yet. And I just want to close by thanking all of our collaborators that have allowed this to happen. Bill and Claudia in London, Elizabeth Sears in Michigan, I don't know if you're here, Uwe Fleckner in Hamburg, and Elif Presetter at the Block Archives. It's been extraordinarily enjoyable. So I'm going to hand over now to Katrina, Max, Pernilla and Karina, who are just going to talk about what's really important tonight, about making models. And then they will hand over in turn to Ellie. So I'm stopping now. I'm muting myself, getting a glass of wine and handing to Katrina. Katrina, you're mute.
Yes. Hi, can you see my screen? Great. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Tim, and also to Bill and the Warburg Institute for inviting us. This is really great. So we will guide you through the exhibition, through each room, where we'll present all the models and also how they come to be. So our first room, in our first room, we will enter Hamburg, represented by the two models Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg and Planetarium Hamburg. So to set you into context, we have here a map of Hamburg with outlines around the buildings, which are situated in two different situations, one in a suburban area and the other in a park.
We lost the share.
You lost the share?
No, still, I still see it.
I swapped, sorry. Forget it.
Okay, we got it. We got it.
Okay. So the first model out is Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg, made of Nora Kilstad and myself, Katrina Tenset-Sundell. KBW was erected in the void between two existing buildings, adjacent to Aby Warburg's home. The building was commissioned by Warburg family and designed by the architect Gerald Langmack. The library, that by then had turned into an institute, inhabited this building from May 1926 until December 1933, when the institute fled to London. I will dive right in presenting the model for you. And since you cannot be present with the model today, I will orbit around it. Here we have a section model, where 1/3 of the building is cut out to the to reveal the inner organization of floors and rooms. The color is an interpretation of the spine color code to letter M in the Warburgian catalog system that Tim introduced. Seeing the model in section, we discover how the functions were divided, that also is present in its change of form and construction. Facing the street, we have the administrative part with offices. Behind, the 4 upper floors held the Institute's stack rooms in its own fireproof construction. Divided into the 4 categories Handlung, action, Wort, word, Orientierung, orientation, and Bild, image. Connecting the levels, the stack rooms had its own internal communication via a spiral staircase in the shaft in the corner. The next part we named the portal, because here you will find the catalog room, as well as the hallway leading to the building's heart, the reading room. Here we deal with a different kind of geometry. Again, the ellipse, culminated by its beautiful overlight. What makes this library stand out from an ordinary one is that you couldn't fetch the book directly from the shelf yourself. You had to go to the catalog room, find a card representing a book, and ask for the book to be brought to you. The vertical communication in the building was for employees only. With our mission to make a model, archival materials such as historical images and drawings has been important for exploring and investigating the building from afar. Plan and section play therefore a crucial role in this understanding. From drawing and images, we were able to construct the model in 3D digitally. From the CAD model, we could retrieve elements and convert them into 2D, which we then got laser cut in MDF and cardboard. This followed by a huge job of organizing all the small pieces. Everything was then sprayed in paint and then glued together, and then sprayed again to make the whole model monochrome. In the exhibition space, you will see directly into the building and onto its backdrop, where the huge windows are giving a view over the landscape and the river Glomma. The model is also in close relation to the wall labels, where you will find information about the model as an object and the actual building's creators and owners that explains KBW's life and change in use.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Max, and in this, or my little small part of this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about how I built the Hamburg planetarium model, or actually models, because this model, as you'll see, was actually built twice. And this model quite quickly kind of, became a really personal project. And it kind of certainly made me reevaluate how I work with the model and what kind of techniques yields the best results, both concerning appearance and expected lifespan of the model. And as you can see here, this is kind of where it started. And I worked, primarily with wood and with very basic knowledge and kind of understanding of the building. And having never been there, I had to work with photos, plans, and sections. I can take next, Katrina. And as you see here, every piece has to be custom made. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how this building would go together. And very early in the process, I learned 2 really important things. Firstly, round or otherwise kind of non-rectilinear pieces are very difficult to work with because they are especially difficult to measure and difficult to handle with machines. And on many occasions, I would make a piece and then I could no longer hold it on the machine. I can only kind of measure it, and then I had to redo it, which was very kind of frustrating. If you take the next one, Katrina. And then secondly, as you see in this photo of the model, wood is a really, really beautiful material to make a model out of, but it just doesn't like to keep its shape, especially when you bend it. And this is how the model looked before Christmas. It was not done by any stretch, but it was not, or it was obviously a building at this point. Next, yeah. And I was, not surprised to find the model bent out of shape after Christmas. And while it's maybe not so obvious in this photo, but it was really quite clear to me that this was just not the way of moving forward. Next. So I had to go back to the drawing board, quite literally, and I started with just making a really good 3D model. And in doing so, I kind of figured out that there was a possibility of kind of casting this model in gypsum, which would kind of mitigate the problem of shrinking and bending. So I made a formwork in 3D, and then next, yeah, I 3D printed it. Then next, and then I picked it up, and I wasn't maybe not so happy with the finish. It needed a lot of work, but yeah, if you take the next, yeah, after a while, eventually it kind of came together, and I was able to put it together to a complete form. Next. And then I had a friend help me, and we poured the plaster, and as plaster really sets up quite quickly, so we had to work really, really quickly. It hardens, within 30 minutes. And then, as you see in the next photo, I think, yeah, I demolded the thing after maybe 2 hours, but it was a very tough situation. It was very, very heavy at this point, very warm and very wet. And then the formwork just didn't want to release. So if you take the next, you can see it has quite a bit of scars, but that's nothing I couldn't fix with just some filler. And then the base of the previous model actually came with me to the next one, because it was completely fine and I could use it. And then the rest of the building, I decided to 3D print out of a kind of it's a plaster powder, which is sintered together. And then next. But as you can see, the real world isn't a 3D model. So I had to do a lot of work to get everything to finish or to fit together. So the next, month was just spent sanding, priming, filling in spots, sanding again. Next. And then, at this point, it was way too heavy for me to carry. So I had this little trolley. I could wheel it around in school. And this is after the first layer of paint. Yeah. And in between these things, I was kind of working on larger pieces and smaller pieces. A lot of things are handmade because it just doesn't make sense to make them out of or 3D print them. And then this was quite a common occurrence. I think this is funny. Or, I'd been working in this place for a long time, and I had all these pieces, all over this. They were all over the workshop. And I think it's a miracle that none of them, fell down or cracked or nothing. But you could see pieces like this laying around. And then, yeah, there was a lot of sanding and a lot of filling in these small gaps. And I think at one point you just kind of have to say to yourself, you're done, and just kind of leave it as it is. And then this is, right around deadline. And I think I said to myself at this point, just one more coat of paint, and then I'm done. And then suddenly came moving day, and I wouldn't say this is probably not the ideal way of moving these models, especially not a model that I've been working on for such a long time. It's very, very nerve-wracking, but it's made its way there. And as you can see, here it is in the exhibition. Yeah.
Yeah. So then we are moving on to the second room, and we are now entering London. Here the Institute has inhabited 3 buildings in different parts of the city: Thames House, Imperial Institute, and its current location at Woburn Square. I will be presenting the model of Thames House made of Paul Louis Sanchez Paredes. Moving from a suburban area in Hamburg, Warburg Institute landed in 1933 at Millbank in an office building, commissioned by Imperial Chemical Industries in 1930. Warburg Institute moved into the ground floor. Paul chose to here make a plan model, where the model shows the exterior as well as the interior, as you can see from above. The interior is based on the drawings outdone by Godfrey Samuel in Tecton, and marks the beginning of an architectural relationship between Tecton and the Warburg Institute, with director Fritz Saxel and assistant director Gertrud Bing. And here we have the interior from above, showing a symmetrical organization of rooms. Onto the street, we have the reading room, centered in between administration on two sides. And in the back, we have the stack room. In between, there is a passage where books are entering from one side and readers from the other. What I can emphasize here, in comparison to Hamburg, is that Warburg Institute had moved from a vertical organized building to a horizontal one. The horizontal organization opened for a closer relation between the reading room and the stack room, which meant that readers actually here could pick up their books directly from a shelf and not had to ask for help. But the catalog principle in the fourth section was maintained, and each section has a relation to the division in Hamburg: Handlung, Bild, Wort, Orientierung. The relationship between the reading room and the stack room was also captured by Paul in his earlier images. As KBW, Thames House is made out of MDF. The model was first made in 3D, converted to 2D elements that later was laser cut. This followed by arrangement of bits and pieces before gluing and then spraying. A huge job that needed assistance from a good helper. At Blaker, you can peek inside the model and see small furnitures inside, and in its close relationship to the drawings on the wall. Behind sits the wall labels, connecting the model to the history of the building, and also information on how the model came to be, by Paul Louis Sanchez.
Hello everyone, my name is Pernille Boye Algren. I will briefly talk about the Imperial Institute being especially relevant in 1952. Next. So here you can see a beautiful plan drawn by Katrine. And next. And this is the facade. So this is a magnificent building. Next, yes. So this being a model with somewhat of a slightly bothersome yet unusual process. Next. And it is quite unique in that sense, and it stands out from the other models. And you can take the next slide, Katrina. We've become more and more fond of it as it now has its personal life and history. Next, Katrina, you will see how it evolves. The reason, so to say, why it's the odd one out, it's because it has more gypsum, 3D printed gypsum, and less plywood than the other models, which means that it's so much more fragile. It just cracks all the time, and it's just completely gone its own way, not wanting to be in our exhibition. And we've been angry on it, but we've also come to sort of a conclusion that, all right, you want to be that way. However, you can take the next one, Katrina. we are now quite satisfied as it is. When it just stood there in the exhibition, it sort of blossomed in a way, although we are still we still want to make a new one. Although this little ugly duckling has now its some sort of its personality of its own. You can take the next one, Katrina. So this is how it is in the London room. And the next one, yes. So it has now its own wall label, and you see the drawings behind by Katrina. Okay, the next one. Moving on to the cottage left to the room left to the Imperial Institute facing the River Glomma, which Fritz Saxel and Gertrude Bing commissioned as a private residence for themselves. Unfortunately, this was not the outcome. However, the architectural process itself, in collaboration with architect Godfrey Samuel from Tecton, is a captivating story. When building this model, we have purposely based the analysis on the letters and drawings which we found in the RIBA archive. Next. So yes, the final proposal has been our main topic of interest, and that is the last proposal before the collaboration between Dr. Saxel, Bing, and Mr. Samuels ended. And Bing and Saxel acknowledge their urge to join their family and friends in America. Next. So here we are, Fritz Saxel and Gertrude Bing, assumingly, most definitely, maybe in a relationship. Next. I will now go through the idea, the proposal, and the making of the model. We are located and situated at Bromley, south of London. Next. In a suburban area. Next. Gertrude Bing and Fritz Saxel once again contacted a young office, Tecton. Next. And next. As we can see in this letter from Gertrude Bing to Godfrey Samuels from 1935, Gertrude Bing was looking for a furnished house, hoping in this letter that she didn't cause too much trouble for Mr. Samuel, that he wasn't too fed up with the back and forth in this process. Next. This was the first proposal of the home. Next. And these are some sketches. Although the final proposal is the one that we'll be having a closer look at now, and is the model that we've made. Next. And what is especially interesting about this is that it's so rigid in how it divides the entrance of Fritz Saxel and Gertrude Bing. Next. The facade of the entrance of Fritz Saxel. Next. And this is an elevation of the facade facing the garden. Next. So the ground floor is Gertrude Bing's apartment, all furnished. She has a kitchen, a guest room, maid, and a living room with both a daybed and, of course, the bookshelves. Next. And the first floor is all Fritz Saxel's, although the guest room and the maid's room is switched out to belong to his children, which he brought from Hamburg as well. Next. And this is an elevation of the entrance of Fritz Saxel. Next. The same with Gertrude Bing. Next. And here you can see the relation of the apartments in a section. And this resulted in the model. Next. Which of course also includes the entrances. Next. So this letter is especially, with its corrections concerning furniture, is quite unique and somehow typical for Gertrude Bing's devotion to rigid systems as the librarian that she is. Next. You can see how, well, it's not so clearly because it's quite detailed, but what is interesting that the furniture, the system of the furniture actually enumerated is included in the drawings by Godfrey Samuels. And the S, which is the yellow marks, is Saxel's furniture, which he borrows he lends them to Gertrude Bing on the ground floor, as she didn't have those many furniture as he has. And this is also discussed in the letters. Next, and we've situated the model in front of the river Glomma, as it is as the actual or proposed building, which is not built, was to be in a suburban area. We wanted to fulfill this thought. Next. And of course, the color is the letter A, which stands for magic, science, and philosophy, this being an abstract project in a way. Next. And the colors, next. And we sprayed them, plywood, gypsum, wood. And next, the entrance being one of the most, the way that they entered the building being one of the most important things about this model. Next. This was somewhat sort of symbolic for the whole model and their relationship. Next. Being so close and yet so far in a way. Next. And next. And of course, Saxel, Dr. Saxel, being so fond of England as he was, we thought it would be amusing to have Riley Monaco Salon from 1937 next, which we added to the model, and the garage being planned in the second proposal of the building. Next. Thank you.
So now we're at, hi, I'm Karina, and I made this final model of the Warburg Institute together with Celia Syme and Amalia Elvgaard. We've put the Warburg model in its own room, the final room. It used to be Guttorm's bedroom, and you can see traces of that in the kind of very intimate paintings on the wall, and also there's a bedside table on one side of the room. Next. Yep, so this is the Warburg Institute at Bloomsbury. Next. It was designed, or it was commissioned to the architects Adams, Holden, and Pearson and completed in 1958, but it seems that the directors at the time, Henry Frankfurt and Gertrude Bing, had kind of quite a big hand in the design and organization of the building. Next. So when we looked at this building, we decided to, because it still exists today, we decided to model it in its state as it was in 1958. And then we kind of identified the most important parts of the building that we wanted to portray. So we would portray, next. We decided to portray the library, which you can see on the left-hand side, the kind of very detailed entrance on the right, and also the fact that it's kind of situated on a corner, but its main entrance is not immediately visible when you approach it. Yeah, and then I guess another point is that, sorry, could you go back? The last point is that kind of with this Woburn Institute, the organization of the Warburg system returns from a horizontal back to a vertical system as it was in the KBW. Next. So next I'll talk a little bit about the model making process. So it's a laser cut model, and we kind of made a 3D model and tried to split it up into layers that could be cut out on a laser cutting machine. Next. So this is all the panels of that compose the model. Next. And then anything that we could kind of engrave or like add detail to the model, we tried to do during the laser cutting process. Next. This is an image of it as it's being assembled. Next. And then as we were making the model, So the model is at 1:75. We found that the size of the model had a very dollhouse feeling to it, and that the kind of protruding / fluted corners we had at the corners of the actual Warburg Institute kind of allowed this opening up, or like this hinged feeling to the facades in which they could kind of be opened up to allow a peek inside. Next. And so this kind of influenced the design of the model base, which kind of also tried to represent the model as it was in 1958. So, and as it is today. So we have the qualities of the building being sunken into the street. We tried to model the entrance in a little more detail, and also kind of to make it a bit more playful with regards to the using that hinged facade in the model itself. Next. And so in terms of color, we originally went with kind of this whitish color that was very neutral to kind of emphasize a different color system, which I'll elaborate on later. But then in the end, we decided to respray the exterior of the model into the color L, like this creamy color. Next. And then a result of that is that we were able to kind of distinguish what was the interior of the building and what was the exterior of the building through these two colors. Next. And then this is kind of the transfer or the development of kind of a very two-dimensional entrance to a three-dimensional one. Next. And then this is the model as it sits in the room. You can kind of see how, despite its very flat facades, you can see in the drawings, the building is actually quite, has a lot of depth in it. Next. And so the next part I'll talk about is about the furnishings of the Woburn Institute. Next. And so we were very interested in the shelves that were designed for the Warburg Institute at Woburn Square, because they were kind of commissioned alongside the design of the building. And Gertrude, or the directors of the Warburg Institute at the time, were very interested in making sure that they kind of could fit as much, could make the spaces as efficient as possible. And then they went into great detail about the dimensions of the things, because moving from Germany to the UK, there was also a conversion system from a metric system to an imperial one. Next. And another thing that we were interested in was the use of the catalog shelves. I guess we're all very aware that the Warburg Institute has a very special or unique way of organizing. So then we thought that it would also be good to kind of model the catalog shelves, which visitors to the library would have to interact with when they came in. Next. And so we tried to translate the color codes by kind of looking at the colors used in the organization system, where they were found on the respective floors of the building, and then translating them into these colored shelves that could be placed back within this model to kind of show this, to kind of express this unique organizational system that exists at the Warburg Institute. Next. And then this is a picture of us making the shelves. Next. A picture of the catalog, the small catalog. Next. And then this is the model as it is in the room. Maybe you can see in the background, but there's kind of the wall labels are placed onto one wall of the room, so that as you rotate around this model, as you visit it, you can it kind of catches your eye and then encourages you to walk closer to it. Next. And these are the labels themselves and a front-facing image of the model. I guess we're also very aware that this building is now undergoing a renovation by Haworth Tompkins. So I guess it's now up to Ellie Sampson from Haworth Tompkins to talk more about this new renovation.
Hello. Okay, let me share my screen. One sec. I don't want to share and you can see, be confusing when we see all of our faces. Okay. Lovely. Okay. Oops, sorry, sneak peek. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yeah,
Great.
that's good.
Lovely. Thank you so much for including me in this wonderful talk, and it's so great to see all your models again, and I feel very proud to come straight after you because they all look fantastic. I thought I'd start just giving an overview of our model making process at Haworth Tompkins. I think these 4 images really kind of encapsulate the different approaches we have to model making in our firm. On the top corner there, you can see the 1 to 25 Bristol Old Vic model. We feel like 1 to 25 is a really good model to get into the space. And we also think it's really great that it runs in parallel to models made by set designers who often work at a 1 to 25 scale when modeling new productions. And coincidentally, this is the model scale that we chose for our Warburg model. 1 to 250 as well, zoomed out scales, putting our models in context. And this is very common with lots of project cited in an urban environment and show the surrounding context. We also test materials and colour schemes on site. This works particularly well as we have a lot of existing envelopes that we work with in our restoration projects. You can see here the Battersea Art Centre testing the colours against the burnt down shell of the building. And then also we have presentation of final models reflecting our fully designed schemes. And this actually isn't that common to just dive into a project at the finalized stage, because we really like using our models as a design tool as we go through. They often run in parallel to the projects that we're working on. Model versus reality. I thought this was a really, there's a set of images from this model that really showcase the importance that we place on model making within the process, as I just said. We use them for light tests, testing surface textures, and the same way that you would do in a CAD model and a CAD render. And in fact, in some jobs, we primarily use models. I think actually on the Battersea Art Centre that you just saw before, there was only 1 render done of it through the whole process, and that was at the very end when it was completely finalised and it was used for promotion by the Battersea Art Centre themselves. So you can really see the kind of the critical kind of crux that models inhabit within our process. I just thought I'd do an overview of the types of models that we make at Haworth Tompkins in this sort of spectrum of models, from sketch models to presentation models. And we also think the intention of the model obviously really dictates everything that comes after. The approach we have, the materials we use, the process we go through, the detail we go into. And I think you can really see here that kind of varies obviously from if we have time, when we have, you know, there's all these different kind of practical and logistical things that also go into why we make the models that we do. Sometimes maximum amounts of detail don't actually give the effective model that we want to make. You can see here from this really, really quick sketch model in the middle there. And then on to more analytical models that we make, really, really kind of testing options within existing spaces. These are, as I mentioned before, all the different lattice ceilings of the Great Hall in Battersea Art Centre, and all the different colours we could choose, and how to test them in lighting conditions, in real lighting conditions. And then all the way through to presentational models we use for competitions, for bids, and as I said before, site tests. So I feel like this kind of combination of models I have here really sums up our model making methodology as well as it is at the moment. We are testing, especially within lockdown, we're trying to test different scales that we wouldn't have tested before. As I say, we normally make really, really big 1 to 25 models, but with they're not being used for engagement when everybody is in the room or around a table looking at these models. And instead they're being photographed and shared. I feel like it really changes the way we've been approaching models for the last year. Also, there's the sense, and you'll see with the Warburg, as we go through the progression of models from a 1 to 250 model through to a 1 to 25 model, we really kind of think that model making can be used both for looking at your models as an object and as an experience. And as was said just previously, the kind of doll's house experience of a model, which I always used to take as is that meaning it's twee? Does that mean that it's you know, something that's kind of all the design is tied up with a bow? But I actually really like gravitate towards that idea of a doll's house now, because it indicates play and you know, kind of fascination and fun that comes with model making and presenting a model to others. I think it's also really important to note the process. A kind of crux of the process for us is having a kind of master model in CAD before we fabricate our final model. We call this, yes, the master model. We model, I model at physical model scale. So this was a 1:50 model where we modeled obviously at 1:50. So it really gets you to think about the thicknesses of materials you're using, whether it be 0.8mm ply and all the way up to things like 10mm foam. We color code this model so we can see, we can edit it constantly, and we can think about all of these pieces coming together. And I'm sure as the students found, like keeping everything in kind of a puzzle that needs to be rummaged around and then laid out systematically is really a key thing to keep as much order as you can going through. So color coding for me is how I do it. So you can understand with these models the spatial qualities of the model as a whole, but then you can also break it down into understandable chunks, both for you and sometimes the team, the client, whoever else is taking a dip into the model process. So the Warburg Institute. I thought I'd do a very quick kind of overview of Haworth Tompkins' proposed scheme, which comprises the refurbishment and extension of the existing Bloomsbury building, not Bloomsbury. The proposal encompasses refurbished stacks, relocation of the archive and photographic collection and into all new purpose design spaces, and then also the opening up of the ground floor to create a new cafe and digital laboratory. So since the early stages of the Warburg's design process, we have been including models at different scales, and they've been developed in parallel to the design. The challenges with a more detailed model, as you'll see with the 1:25 model, was trying to capture as much of the existing character of the spaces as possible, and really including this rich palette of existing materials. The proposed material palette focusing on the courtyard extension as the 1:25 model that we made did. And the key here was to build up the detail of the existing and the proposed together incrementally as the design and its relationship to the existing courtyard came into focus. Initial massing moves of the new courtyard extension and then through to fully fleshing out the detail of the finishes of the proposal. So you can see here going from a massing model, which I don't talk about in great detail because I feel that the 1:250 model was the real starting point for the decision to bump up the scale to a 1:25 sectional model. This laser cut concept model was used at the initial stages, trying to figure out how the proposal and the extension would sit within the existing courtyard envelope. We just showed the simple openings and we extended the model actually to the terraces that sit adjacent to the building to see how our proposal would fit within this sort of like this permeable enclosure. We bumped up the scale. Oh, also, sorry, just seeing those next to each other, I feel like I saw this in a presentation by the Warburg team, and you can really see how the aerial shot of that model really relates to the plan and the ground floor plan as it is developing now, and how we changed the proposal of the extension within the courtyard to quite a contained something that then kind of really tried to kind of integrate itself within the rest of that plan and open up that ground floor space and its relationship as well, obviously, to the street, which with the 1:25 model, which is almost like a stage set of these walls of the existing courtyard. For me as a model maker, it's always really interesting to see it then fitting back into its context. I can see how it links into these spaces, and even talking to the students that were doing the Bloomsbury building in their own projects, seeing its relationship back onto the street for me is really like interesting. It kind of gets me thinking differently about the 1:25 model. So as I said before, we built the idea of building up the detail of this model incrementally. You can really see it here with the courtyard shell, as we called it, which you can just see with its foam board kind of carcass, basically, at the very initial stages, no details in the windows or anything. Our expectations of the scale that we needed changed initially, not just from the 1:250 model, but initially we were thinking about a 1:50 model. Because of the practicalities of the model needing to travel back and forth to client meetings, storing it within our office without it getting damaged, all those sort of practicalities sometimes do come into play when you are designing a model. Also how it would be assembled and disassembled for presentational use. But as soon as we printed out like a 1:50, this shell at 1:50, it just felt too small. And Graham always said he wanted it, instead of a doll's house, he always said he wants it as a Wendy house size. So it's more experience and less of an object. You can see our initial tests with the 1:25 model, and revealing the detail of the spatial challenges that couldn't be glossed over is the key here with the 1:25 model. The openings of the courtyard play a significant role, as you can see within these initial images. The importance of natural light, the positions of the light wells within our proposal, the views between the existing and the proposed spaces. The nuances of all of these connections could much more easily be explored at this scale. So adding more detail as the project developed. I think it's actually really key to think about the idea of we could have just done a fully polished, fully realized existing envelope for this courtyard and then plugged our design in and change it week upon week. But the idea of adding detail incrementally just felt really right for this project. I sometimes feel if we create like a really polished existing element of the building, it then stops. We always become too precious about it. It kind of distances ourselves. We keep the existing at arm's length instead of really trying to think about how these things will integrate. And we added, as you can see, detail as and when it was needed, to progressing with these weekly meetings. Sometimes I get the sense that the ply finish that we actually had of the internal courtyard facades was a kind of choice at this point. We chose not to put on the layer of tiles, like quite distinctive white tiles within this space, because it really gave a kind of warm tone to the building. We weren't 100% sure of the finishes of the proposal at this point, so it kept everything quite loose, which I think really suits the model at this stage. And then when it came through to the final model, there was the cohesion that we needed at those final stages. But similar to the Battersea Arts Centre model, this model kind of took on a life of its own, in the sense of this became a key thing for like selling our design, as opposed to using renders and views as projects often do. And it was really good we pursued this scale as images of the model and the model itself within meetings and within presentations, gave another layer of understanding and appreciating the design, as you can see. It became more of a stage set actually than any other model that I've made, which is interesting because at Haworth Tompkins we do often use, as I said before, 1:25 models for performance spaces. So the maneuvering of the walls into place and the order that you have to piece the model together in, it feels quite ceremonial and performance-like, which is really interesting considering that on the surface this wouldn't be a performance space in the traditional senses of what all the other theatres that we've designed and made models for. Just a quick one on models, tests and alterations, and also the importance of the furniture within this, as with every good doll's house, the furniture within this space. We kind of extended the scenery of the courtyard for tests of the stair. We developed more bespoke furniture, quite like props, again, tying into this sort of performative parallel of this kind of performative model. I think it's a funny thing with occupying a model and model occupation when you're using people, when you're using furniture, as with a render. If you get that element wrong, it can really take you out of the experience. It can really, you want that suspension of disbelief. And I feel like if you make the components and the furniture within the model sort of be well made, but then sort of you want it to blend into the background. It doesn't want to be glaringly obvious. You want to appreciate the space itself. And then there was a second stage to developing this model. We made an entire new courtyard extension about this time last year, in fact, and I was actually in the process of designing this model when lockdown came into play in the UK. And the model of the model process that I mentioned before just became really significant here when marking up with the rest of the team whilst working remotely. The workshop and the model making area, as with any practice, I'm sure, but it seems from my experience, particularly at Haworth Tompkins, is a real cornerstone of the practice. It's a space that people come in and can feel less pressure to just, you can comment on things, you can have a cup of tea in your hand. It's a really informal space. And I was actually surprised. I was worried that the idea of logging into Zoom and having to schedule meetings will rob us of that informality, but actually it kind of kept going when this model could be the thing that we're sitting around. Although it's digital, we could be sitting around and commenting on. Then the making process, as it was the full national lockdown, my workshop became my front room, much to my boyfriend's chagrin. We're trying to, in this case, this was making the internal extension, and it was trying to replicate the idea of concrete when using ply, which is really kind of interesting. It's tricky because the grain of wood instantly gives away the scale when you're working with a model where you're including all of the surfaces. As I said before, it didn't matter so much because it still had an element of looseness about it. But if we were going to be portraying all of the surfaces within the space, you know, we kind of had to disguise the wood, which again, not to link too much back to the theatrical and the performance space, but the idea of, you know, having wood and having to disguise it as marble or disguise it as stone, which is such a huge part of kind of the history of, you know, set design, and that kind of illusion was really interesting. In this case, turning ply into concrete was a case of polyfilling everything and sanding it down and then polyfilling and sanding again, predominantly on my balcony. As you can see here, this is a kind of first stage of polyfilling, creating that really smooth surface to spray paint onto. Creating the internal finishes once we'd got the overall frame down was actually a trickier process than I thought it was. This is where you do really need to be in the room, because when you're judging model samples and how the light plays on certain textures and colors, this actually became quite tricky, because when you take photos of things, when you're taking photos in natural light versus artificial light, it really changes the color of things. So we had, I made up a series of test boards and sample boards that I took lots of photos of and shared with the team as like a presentation. But this is the point that I really did feel like it would be great if we could all be together, hunched around this table, looking at these samples and deciding what would work best within the model. Then came the process of piecing everything together again, and then adding detail within that space. You can kind of see here the ply texture, the raw texture of the ply for the rear elevation is still in place there. And this was Mara, who was shadowing me at this point in time, watching me as I assembled this model, added elements to it. And it was really interesting actually, because it really made me think about the way that I was doing things. Normally you go into a bit of a trance when you're making a model, but it was really interesting to kind of explain things as I went along to Mara. And then these are the final model shots taken by our in-house photographer and architect extraordinaire, Fred. He really captured the warmth that kind of light well brings to the lecture theatre space, and really kind of captured the grain of the materials that we were using. Say, for instance, to get the perfect colour of the Roman blinds, we used an existing sample that we had used previously and cut it to these miniature curtains, which I kind of hemmed myself. And this did feel like kind of doll's house territory, but in a great way. But the colour really comes through, I feel like there's not much I can say that I haven't said already about the model, but I do think adding the tiles, say, to the courtyard shell really kind of brings it to life for me, really gives you a sense of scale, and makes you feel like you can really get into the space, as I said before. And just another kind of point, which I haven't mentioned before, the idea of assembling this and the choreography of putting this together. All of these walls are detachable, and you can put there's a wall that can cover this side of the model, so it can be viewed from the other side, or it can be viewed as a sectional model. Zoom ins. And yes, that's all.
Wow. Ellie, that's just spectacular. And I'm really glad you were able to talk us through. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
And of course, thank you for all your work and helping us to work out what we're building.